Morning, everybody. We're just going to do a short video on Chapter 3. You can see we've been joined by the great Pushkin, who is unimpressed that I have invaded his sleeping space. Chapter 3 introduces us to a couple of new things, variations on stuff you've already learned. So we're going to get one more element of verb use and two more elements of noun use. With the verbs, we're adding a new mood. So you remember that verbs are identified by person, number, tense, mood, and voice. So 5 identifiers. Person and number work together to tell you who is doing the action. The tense tells you when in time. And mood tells you what quality the verb has. Mood is kind of hard to explain. I'll be posting a TED lecture by an ex-classics guy about the subjunctive mood, which is one of the more complicated ones. But the indicative mood, which you've learned already, is one that gets used most frequently. The indicative mood shows reality. That's basically the idea, is that it states things that are real. The infinitive, you've learned, also states the verbal action, right? So it's not bounded by person or number. It's infinite in that sense. It does have tense. But that mood, the infinitive, sort of just is the action. The imperative, which is the one we're going to learn this time, is how the mood you use to give commands. Okay, so clean your room, do your homework, that kind of thing. In Latin, that is a different mood. All of these moods have tense, and they can have voice. Some of them can have person and number, okay, but they all exist as different things because they give a different quality to the verb. So with the indicative, you state something that's real, but with the imperative, you give an order. And, in English, we have different ways of doing the same thing. We don't think of them as different moods of the verbs, but they're there anyway. Now, you can see on page 23 of the book what the imperative mood is used for. And you can see there also that in Latin, you really only use the second person singular and the second person plural for the imperative. All right? The endings are patterned on the first and second conjugations. They are sort of what you'd expect. So for first conjugation, you have that long A that's characteristic of the imperative. You'll see that it's not possible to confuse the imperative with the indicative, right? Nothing in the indicative ends with just a long A or with a long A-T-E. Same for the second conjugation. There's nothing in the indicative that ends with just the long E, and there's nothing that ends with the long E-T-E. So that mood is easily distinguishable from the indicative. We're also being given some new cases in this chapter, the genitive and the dative case. They also talk about the vocative, but we're not going to worry too much about that, as I said before. You'll see in the example sentences that it's really easy to spot. It doesn't actually have a grammatical function, and you'll be able to tell what it's there for. Now, something really, really important about the genitive and the dative cases, and this will be true for the ablative later as well. English tends to use prepositions, and these prepositions are like of, to, for, by, with, from. We tend to use those with a noun to express the same thing, the same idea, the same function that just the noun with its case means in Latin. So you'll find that you're not needing to translate the words like of, right, from when you move from English to Latin, or that you'll have to add them in when you move from Latin to English. We had to be really careful not to clearly identify an English use with a Latin case. Okay, now it's true that, for example, as we'll talk about with the genitive, that genitives can be used to show possession, but that's not all that the genitives do. So we need to have an umbrella term, a broader way of understanding each of these cases into which we can add all of the different uses. All right, does that make sense? So if it doesn't, make sure that you're sending me questions by email or bringing it up on the discussion board. Okay, so the genitive case. Now, the genitive case is introduced in this chapter as the possessive case, and Shelmerdine suggests that you use the translation of and whatever the noun is. And that's fair enough, and that will actually take you a long way, but it's not actually a good way to think about the genitive case, because it's not going to help you later on. So the umbrella way to understand the genitive, so the broader definition of the genitive, is actually pretty straightforward. You use the genitive to make one noun modify another noun. Okay? The genitive case is the case you use to make one noun modify another noun. Now, Latin has a different part of speech that does the same job, and that's the adjective. And there goes Pushkin. And Latin will use the adjective the same way. English has adjectives too. Both the genitive case and the adjective tell you something more about a noun. So, for instance, in the possessive examples given on page 24, section 18, liber puellae and animus viri, both puellae and viri are telling you more about the nouns liber and animus. It's not just a book, it is the book of a girl. It is not just a spirit, it is the spirit of a man. The effect is just like using an adjective, i.e., it is a black book, it is a red book, right? It is a courageous spirit, it is a fearful spirit. This is true for the partitive examples too, the second use of the genitive they're introducing this time. What kind of crowd is it? Well, it's a crowd made up of men. Now, it's not all men who are in the crowd, but the crowd is formed out of a part of all men who exist everywhere. All right? So the partitive genitive shows you the whole out of which a small part is being described. That's the genitive case so far. It is the way in which you use a noun to describe another noun. And so I sometimes like to call the genitive case the adjectival case. And this is our big umbrella under which we can fit in all of the uses of the genitive. Okay? And again, if you have questions, make sure you're asking them, discussion board or email. All right, so the dative case. Now, we actually have a verb in Latin, do, dare, is a first conjugation verb, and it means to give. The dative case is actually made, that word dative comes from the Latin verb do, dare. All of these cases are Latin terms, and they mean something that help explain what they're doing. Now, the dative case in Shelmerdine shows the person or thing with reference to whom an action takes place. We have specific uses of it that are described, like the indirect object or the dative of reference. But Romans didn't think in those terms. These are just ways for us to understand how Latin is like English. In Latin, it's just the dative case. Every single use of the dative is the dative case. We tend to subdivide it into different kinds. Now, when the dative is being used in the way that what we call in English the indirect object, that's great, and it's often used with verbs like give. I give a book to him. I give a book to her. The to him and the to her would be expressed in Latin just as a noun in the dative case. But thinking about it as an indirect object is not always the best way to think about the dative, because the dative actually has quite a number of other things that it does. And we'll be gradually getting more and more of these as we go through. Shelmerdine tends to give you the ones that have the closest relationship to English to get you comfortable with it. Okay? So I'd like you to think about the dative case as the way Latin gives you a reference point for understanding an action. I give a book, well, with reference to what? With reference to her. Okay? I give a cake, with reference to what? Well, the point of reference for me giving the cake is him. I give a cake to him. And by having this sort of broader framework, right, all of the other uses of the dative are going to make a little bit more sense. So, genitive and dative, practice using those. The sentences that you've got in the book are getting a little more complex. What you need to do is really figure out what each noun is doing. Don't rely on word order, but figure out what each noun is doing. There will be a video for Chapter 3 called Reading with Expectations. It'll basically be a screencast of a PowerPoint, but I'll show you how to work your way through a Latin sentence, not guessing at the meaning, but using the meaning of the nouns and of the cases to construct the right kind of sense from Latin. All right, hope that helps, and again, please ask those questions.